But at some point, one starts to look around. And you start to realize that things have changed quite a bit. The orientation, that which oriented us in our lives before, is no longer there. Those beliefs that we grabbed on and used to orient ourselves and define ourselves are now seen to be empty, to be of no substance. A lot of the egoic motivations are now disappeared. Either they're completely disappeared, or if it's a momentary awakening, they're in the process of disappearing. This can be very, very disorienting to the mind, because it's only at this particular point that people start to realize that literally almost everything that motivated them in life was self-centered. And I don't mean that in a negative way or a judgmental way. I just mean that the energy that moved oneself in life, when we're in the dream state, when we're in the state of consciousness of egoic consciousness, literally the driving force, the energy that's propelling us through life is very self-centered. It's what I want, what I don't want, what can I achieve, who can love me, how much joy can I get, how much happiness can I get, how much unhappiness can I avoid, can I get the right job, can I find the right lover, will I get enlightened. These are all self-centered emotions, self-centered motivations. It comes from, the energy comes from the egoic state of consciousness. And again, this isn't bad or wrong, it's just the way it is. When we're functioning in the dream state, we're literally being fueled and propelled by the dream state. And our concerns are dictated by the dream state. Again, the dream state is the state where we perceive separation, where we think we're a separate entity and a separate being. And so that separate being is always seeking something. Love, approval, success, money, maybe even enlightenment. But with real awakening, that whole structure begins to disappear. It begins to dissolve under one's feet. And of course, there's still a human being there. And in many ways, the basic personality of the human being has survived intact. Awakening doesn't necessarily demolish our personality. It doesn't dissolve our personality. It dissolves our identification with ego and our identification with personality. But every body has a personality structure. Jesus had a personality. Buddha had a personality. Everybody that walks on the earth has a personality. Infants, when they come out of their mother's wombs, have personalities. Before they've ingested any of the conditioning of society, before their teachers or parents have taught them how to create a personality. It's inherent in being. It's one of the beauties of being that every being has a different personality. Dogs and cats have different personalities, one to the other. Birds have different personalities. Trees have different personalities. So, once we've seen beyond the veil of separation, there's still a basic personality structure there. Depending on how deeply we've seen, or how transformative the scene has been, the egoic structure is much looser. It may be all but dissolved. But there's still a basic personality structure. There's still a human. And that human now has all of its old orienting principles, all of its drives, all of its self-centered drives are now either disappeared or they're in the process of disappearing. Now, this can be extraordinarily disorienting to people. I have many people that come to me and have many, many questions about this particular part of the process. In my own case, I had my first glimpse beyond the veil, my first awakening when I was 25. It was of the non-abiding variety. It didn't stay permanent, but it's certainly something about that scene of reality never left. I never really lost sight of it. Somewhere inside, I always knew that everything was one, that what I was eternal, was unborn, undying, and uncreated. that my essential nature was not limited or confined to the personality structure or the body that I seemed to be inhabiting. And yet, at that initial glimpse of reality, that initial awakening to my true nature, it wasn't really completely abiding, but there was the dissolving in a somewhat radical way of the world as I had seen it, the self that I knew myself to be. It was actually quite odd to be walking around in life without all these self-motivations. I wouldn't say they were all gone by any means. There was still some self-centered motivations and egoic-centered energy still happening. I'll talk about some of that later as we go on. But there was an immense amount of disillusionment at the level of ego and the level of the basic energy force that's derived from ego. And all of a sudden, what motivated me before, I wasn't motivated by. I walked around going, well, why should I do this? Why should I do that? I'm not really motivated to do this anymore, that anymore. The things I love doing, I didn't necessarily love doing anymore. It's not that I resisted them or hated doing them. It's just that there was an absence of self-centered energy. And it was very disorienting for quite some time. And I find this with lots of people that I speak with. People come to me and say, gee, I used to have all these things I love to do. I used to have hobbies, and I used to like to go to dinner parties, or, whatever it was. I used to be into kite flying or, running or whatever it is. And it's common for some of these interests to start to wane. This doesn't mean all your interests will wane, but those that are being derived from the energy of separation, that are literally expressions of divisions of ego, those interests will start to disappear. Those motivations will suddenly seem like almost as if, where did they go? And initially, there's nothing often that replaces it. As we're dissolving, as a glimpse of reality begins the dissolving of the egoic structure in earnest, this dissolving is very disorienting. We look around and we think, I always wanted my ego to dissolve. If we're in spiritual practice, it's one of the things that we hope for, that I won't be confined to this ego forever, that maybe I can wake up from it or it will dissolve. Well, awakening itself isn't the same as egoic dissolving. We can wake up whether our ego is dissolved or not. In fact, very, very strong egos can awaken. Very destructive egos can awaken. But the result of the awakening, the fallout of the awakening, the aftermath of the awakening, on the human level, is a radical dissolving of ego. It begins the process. This doesn't mean that ego will be in cooperation. Ego may resist this dissolving with everything it has. Ego may resist this dissolving with the entirety of its arsenal. But nonetheless, reality will have begun the process. The disillusionment has begun. And ultimately, once you've had the glimpse, there's nothing you can do to stop it, not forever. But this dissolving, as I've said, can be very disorienting. And one of the things I often say to people is, of course, it's disorienting to your mind. Awakening itself can be very disorienting. Everything you thought was true, you now see isn't. The person you thought you were, you now see you're not. That itself can be at once blissful and a tremendous relief, and it can also simultaneously be experienced as very disorienting. Like, who am I going to be now? And what's going to move me? And what's going to motivate this being? Now, of course, if one was fully awake, one wouldn't have these questions. But that's very rare initially. Mostly, there's a process after this awakening. And so there are these questions and there are these experiences. And there's no pat answers that a spiritual teacher can give to somebody. Oh, here's how to orient yourself. Because that would just be taken by the ego again. What's much more useful is just to understand that to be disoriented is part of the process of awakening. It's totally natural to be disoriented because everything's new. You're new. Your perception is new. Your perception of everything and everyone is now changed. It's altered. And yet, the disorientation actually arises because the mind is struggling to know. It's like when you fall out of a plane. If you're just falling through space, there's no problem. But imagine you're falling through space and you start to grasp at space as if to find your bearings, as if to stop your fall. As soon as you start grasping, you feel very disoriented. You don't know which is up and which is down, or where you are or where you're not. So the disorientation is not necessarily inherent in the awakened view. The disorientation actually arises from the mind trying to find orientation.